Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Preston podcast. This is part two of the Problems of Privatizing National Defense series. Today I'm joined by Henry Mencken and Keith Preston. Now, this is a sort of a follow-up, I suppose, to the debate that I recently had with Bob Murphy on the Tom Woods show. And one of the things that I had pointed out as a problem for privatizing national defense is organizing the actual mobilization. So the libertarians are going to reject conscription as what they call slavery. So how are you going to motivate enough people to take a bullet to get on the battlefield to get shot at? From an economic incentive point of view, one of the problems is, well, if you're dead, there's no payday. So there's even if you pay people to fight, there's going to be an incentive for them not to fight. Two classic examples would be in Italy during the Condotta period. And in that period, guys would often flip sides or just avoid fighting entirely and just kind of abscond with the money. And there's another thing, if I remember correctly, in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, there were private security forces that the United States military had outsourced some of its logistics to private contractors. And they said that the march on Baghdad was getting too hot. And so that they didn't want to march into the fire like that. And they had to figure out some other solution to giving the troops supplies on the march to Baghdad. So we see that that's a problem. And then the problem that I see with volunteers is traditionally in the United States we had volunteers. In the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Civil War, and they would be given cash bounties. But the problem was they'd take the bounties and go home. They were called bounty jumpers. And in not 1812, but in the Revolution and in the Civil War, all sides resorted to conscription, in part because of that problem. And the mercenaries are historically unreliable. They tend to flip sides. So, for example, one of the incentives for a mercenary is when you're fighting somebody, you know your own employer's dispositions better than your opponent. So if you want to live to spend the money you got paid, it's in your rational self-interest to flip over to the other side because you have the insider technical knowledge on your employer. And if you give that to the other side and they pay you as well, you get to double dip and are more likely to live to fight another day. And so I think these are a lot of sort of problems that beset private production of mobilizing the troops. So I guess since you actually did serve in the Middle East, Mencken, what are some of your thoughts on these private problems of mobilization?
A number of things come to mind. And for our audience who don't know me, I'm Mencken's Ghost. I'm one of the co-hosts of Rebel Yell podcast. And I'm a Southern nationalist affiliated with the alternative right, broadly speaking. And I do have a background in Austrian economics and anarcho-capitalist theory. And without getting too much in my professional background, I've got some education in organizational theory as well as I was a military officer at one point. So I guess the biggest good quick introduction I had, especially what came up because I was one of the people who helped you prepare for your debate with Robert Murphy. I think in many ways, anarcho-capitalists, in particular, they tend to look at the issue of privatization of defense and tend to look at it in a vacuum where they use theory and think that because they have a perfectly articulated theory, that's the same thing as saying it's going to work in the field of human endeavors. And one of the things I had brought offline with you is I'm not somebody who's necessarily opposed to privatized security and defense, and I'm not at all opposed, or I'm not somebody who thinks it can't happen, because it has happened in different times and places with differing degrees of success. The biggest issue I have in whole when you look at the the anarcho-capitalist theory of private defense is there's a lot of misuse of terminology, or they switch the meaning of terms occasionally where they think a non-state actor, military or militia is an example of a private organization, whereas they like to think of it as a state institution as soon as they have conscription, where at the same time they advocate for Switzerland as being, the perfect example of how, a non-state defense could work in practice while ignoring the fact that it's built upon conscription. And also looking at the fact that very often private in public, private in the institution of the state, is not necessarily a firm distinction. In ancient Rome, especially during the Republican period, there was not a whole lot of a distinction between what was private and what was public, since part of the job of senators was to take their personal wealth and pay for public utilities and things of that nature. So again, I think all sides are guilty of this, but I think anarcho-capitalists in particular look at the current circumstances and project those in the past as if the model for the state we have today is somehow the model that all polities have been in all times and places. And I think that most of the establishment similarly does that.
So would you say, if we phrase it this way, it's not so much the privatized defense is ipso post facto impossible, but none of the proposed solutions of the ANCAPs are workable?
That's a good, really simplified version of that. And again, I think that they have lots of very good theories, and I think many of these ideas may prove useful in the real world in some manner, but like all political ideologies, there's a big difference between what's initially conceived by pure political philosophers and what it looks like in practice in the real world. And I think with anarcho-capitalism, especially this reliance on the non-aggression principle as being the guiding, light of morality there, unfortunately, many anarcho-capitalists miss the part that these theories in practice are going to require initiating force and defining a clear in-group and defining social obligations. So it's less that they can't work, I guess, than the fact that it's going to rely on things that they consider politically unacceptable or morally unacceptable, I think.
Now, you brought up a very good point, Mencken, about in the late Roman Republic, how private and public distinctions were blurred. And this ties into the PDAs and having private military forces in the first place. In the Mises Wiki, which I suppose has gotten the stamp of approval from the Mises Institute, when they look for historical examples of PDAs, they point exactly to what you just linked to, the late Roman Republic. But the fact is, these late Roman Republican senators were, if anything, but respecters of the nap. They were extremely imperialistic. I mean, Crassus raised an army to invade Persia. Caesar raised an army to invade Gaul. I mean, the idea of these private armies as if they would be somehow less predatory than the state is just laughable. But I guess, so Keith, what are some of your thoughts on what we just brought up about the dangers and pitfalls of privatizing national defense?
Well, the point that's been brought up about the way in which you can't really draw the kind of neat and tidy distinction between the private and the public is an important one. A lot of libertarian theory operates within this framework that is oriented towards critiques of modern states of the kind that we're familiar with. But the modern states are different in kind from a lot of older types of states. If you go back and look at the way in which ancient states or medieval states were organized, what you see is an important difference, and that is older states tend to be based on the idea of personal rule, whereas modern states tend to be based on the idea of collective corporate rule. And what I mean by that is the state in older societies was identified with an individual. The state is the Caesar, it is the Pharaoh, it is the feudal lord or the chieftain of the tribe or whatever. But political leadership in older societies was based on the identity of an individual, and that individual essentially was the state. One of the innovations in statecraft that was made in the early modern period was the introduction of the idea of the corporate state. And I don't mean a corporation in a modern sense, although it's a somewhat relevant term as well, but the idea that the state is an institution that has an institutional life of its own that goes beyond the individuals involved. When we think of the United States government, for example, we don't just think of President Donald Trump or President Barack Obama or whomever. The presidents come and go, the senators come and go, the Supreme Court justices come and go, and all of that. But the same corporate entity remains in place, just like a private business corporation it works the same way. The business corporation can survive for centuries after the original founders and owners have died. The Ford Motor Car Company still exists, even though Henry Ford is long gone. So that's an important distinction between modern states and ancient states. So when you say that ancient states or ancient societies were able to organize private defense. Well, their so-called private defense was essentially a state. It was a state that was associated with a particular type of individual. So that's one serious problem with this theory.
Yeah, just to cut you off for a second, and I have this habit, I'm sorry. It's worthwhile understanding that many people in political theory, actual bona fide political scientists who talk on this point, they describe the state very narrowly, as as in particular, more or less the way you did, as the modern corporate state, or at least the post-Westphalian state. And it's generally described or defined as something like a geographic monopoly on legitimated violence and adjudication, which automatically probably cuts out 2/3 of the governments in all of human history. It doesn't necessarily mean it's atomized individualism.
Yeah, that's an important point. I mean, the whole concept of the state has come to mean something different in modern times compared to what it meant in older times. I think that's one problem. But the model of statecraft that, the model of private defense that libertarians or anarcho-capitalists hold to is based on something much more specific than the mere privatization of defense services. For example, you could argue that any kind of organization that is not organized by a formal state like the American government or the British government or the Russian government or whatever, you could argue that anything of that type, any non-state actor is a private defense organization by this standard. You could say Hezbollah is a private defense organization, or the PKK militias in Kurdistan, or the FARC in Colombia, or the Shining Path, a Maoist group in Peru. You could say any of these things are PDAs in the sense that they are institutions that are not organized by the kind of Westphalian state that was described earlier. The problem, though, is that the libertarians often take it much further, and they want to insist that this is that these need to be commercial enterprises, that these are going to function in the same way as companies that manufacture shoes or automobiles or computers and things like that, and meaning they're going to be driven entirely by economic incentives and by market incentives. And to be authentically libertarian, they have to abide by the non-aggression principle. Now, having a business corporation that operates its own private armies and expecting an institution like that to abide by the non-aggression principle is going to be a somewhat difficult undertaking. It's not theoretically impossible. I mean, you could have a wider culture in a society that has an underlying cultural value that greatly frowns on military aggression by private entities or whatever, in the same way that one thing that prevents a military coup in our own society is we have this long-standing, centuries-old, deeply ingrained tradition of civilian government, the idea that the military and the civilian government should be kept separate. So you could have a cultural barrier like that to violations of the non-aggression principle. But on the question of mobilization, anybody that's ever spent any time analyzing corporations knows that corporations are about maximizing profits, not advancing ideologies per se. I mean, corporations can advance any kind of ideology. And back in the 1950s, when patriotism and civic nationalism and things like that were popular, Coca-Cola or General Motors and companies like that would come up with slogans like, our business is the American business, or what's good for us is good for America, or whatever. Nowadays, that kind of nationalism or patriotism is not really as popular. Instead, a lot of the contemporary corporations will use politically correct slogan or progressive liberal sounding slogans. Corporations will fall all over themselves to show how committed they are to equal opportunity and diversity and multiculturalism and gay rights, and they'll donate money to LGBT organizations and things like that. So all of that, though, was a marketing gimmick. I mean, it's, in any context, it's all about, presenting a certain image for the corporation. It's all about doing so in a way that generates profit. I mean, anybody that studied Business Theory 101 understands this. So business corporations that are operating their private armies are going to have as one incentive, and that's to make money. not to fight wars to win. Now, it's possible you can have leadership of an organization of this type that also is committed to some kind of ideal and wants to fight for that reason and is willing to donate their resources for that reason. But more often than not, that's going to require sacrifice rather than profitability. And as far as mobilizing troops, there are certainly plenty of arguments in favor of the idea that people can be mobilized to fight for reasons other than coercion, like being drafted, or financial reasons, like simply getting paid. I mean, all over the world, there are guerrilla organizations and terrorist groups and other armed struggle-oriented groups whose members aren't there simply because they were forced to be there or because they're getting paid. They actually believe in this cause, whatever it is they're fighting for. Now, there's the question of how effective these organizations are when it comes to fighting mass armies and state armies and things like that, but that's a different question. But the problem with mercenaries is, and the fact that libertarians rely on mercenary organizations as some model for some private organization, I think is problematic because of the kind of perverse incentives that's involved in that. I personally have known mercenaries. I've known people that work for Blackwater and organizations like that. And if you spend any time talking to these people, they're not there because they believe in any ideology per se. Most of them are the same kinds of people you meet in the mafia. I mean, they're greed heads. They're there for the money, or they just like violence, period. They don't care whose side they're on. They're just not, you know. I knew one guy that worked for Blackwater that used to brag about how many people he killed in Afghanistan and all the gruesome methods he used to do it and stuff like that. You know, whether you want people of this caliber to be the ones you rely on to protect society during a time of an emergency is a pretty dubious proposition. So all of these things aren't really being taken into account with some of these theories. You know, this whole idea is a very deterministic philosophy. It's this idea that, well, we have the economic theory, you know, market principles work better in the production of services, say central planning, so they proceed from there to treat military production as if it's no different than producing hot dogs or something like that. Yeah. And it's I think that's the real problem with it.
Yeah, one thing is to phrase the actual problem as concisely as possible. I think the way that I would go about it is this. Cerebus paribus, for any two nations of roughly the equal population, the population that can mobilize the greater number of its population for war is more likely to win that war. And a classic example of this is in World War I. In World War I, the British, for the first 2 years of the war, fought without conscription. And they also had the economy for the first year not being controlled by the government. It was still essentially a economy run during peacetime controls. And they figured out they couldn't get enough people to fight. Surprise, surprise, the war in Europe against the Germans with the Derby scheme. And they ended up with in 1916 passing the Military Service Bill, which recruited the English population for war. Now, it is true that BEF was more highly trained than the German forces, like at the Battle of Mons and in the northwest front of France. But the thing is, though, they were massively outnumbered, and Mons was a tactical defeat. So technically, being better troops, there's a marginal cutoff where if there's enough enemy troops, it doesn't really matter. I mean, Thermopylae is a good example.
Yeah.
Once the sport, go ahead.
I was just going to interject and say, yeah, the British Expeditionary Forces may have been better trained at the outset, but that definitely wasn't true as the war went on. Germany and Austro-Hungarian Empire in particular adapted, and they produced something like third generation warfare by the end with infiltration tactics. So the Germans possessed that sort of interior organizational culture to operate. It's sort of like a learning organization that adapts, and they adapted better than the English did.
But the point is that the idea that you have a small professional army, armies in the modern age cannot win. The Middle Ages was dominated by small professional armies. What ended up happening is you had the rise of standing national armies, beginning with the end of the 30 Years' War, the end of the 100 Years' War, rather. It doesn't really matter if you're worth 10 of the other guy when for every one of you he has 50. It just doesn't matter because there's so many of the other guy to fight with. The only way that could work is if the technological ratio was like conquistadors versus the Aztecs. And even in that case, that wouldn't have worked because the conquistadors needed massive aid from indigenous allies. So again, there's this really bizarre understanding of history that, yes, quality does matter, but as Stalin famously said, quantity has a quality all its own.
Yeah.
And the problem is, there is obviously a threshold where if you have, say, a 10-to-1 ratio of superiority in training, that you can maintain an equilibrium. You know, think of like in the Dune novels where the Imperium has the Sardaukar, which have a 10-to-1 superiority over the Landsraad troops, and that's conceivable that could maintain the status quo. But once you upset the balance of the status quo, then that's not enough. But how do you maintain the 10-to-1? I mean, to maintain that level of rigorous military superiority, you have to basically be Sparta. You have to be Sparta, and the libertarian communities would not put up with something like the Agogay.
It's not Sparta.
Yeah.
I would add to that too, something that's missed by most armchair theorists who insist on talking about warfare is the act of fighting a war. Yes, good organizations frequently adapt and have a sharper edge, like the German military in the First World War. But there's always attrition. There is always material breakdowns. There's always cultural and organizational breakdowns with prolonged conflict. So yeah, that 10-to-1 advantage becomes harder and harder as important people die in combat.
Oh yeah, exactly. And again, we do get to the problem of motivation. I mean, let's say you're going to do, let's say we have Ancapistan in the lower 48, and then we have a Red Dawn style invasion. Because of course, I don't think the libertarians are constantly telling us there isn't going to be a large U.S. imperial armed forces. Okay, so let's say you go up to the volunteer recruiting office in Texas, and well, what are you going to do? You're going to pay like a bounty to go off and fight the commies, and the odds of you dying are pretty high. I mean, how is that sales pitch going to work? Is it going to be like the Starship Troopers where, hey, go fight space bugs and die on the first battle? I mean, I don't see how that you're going to get enough people to be invested in the long run to fight off a Red Dawn style invasion in Ancapistan.
Yeah. And realistically, I think over some time you'd see the development of something like Hezbollah, which is private in the sense of it not being a true state, but at the same time, it's not driven by economic profit. It's driven by ideology to some degree, but more than anything about in-group identity and a collective mutual aid is what drove many of the actual working private defense solutions.
Exactly. That's a good point that you and Keith both brought up. Is one of the key limitations of libertarian theory is it has a sort of like reductionist economic calculation, utilitarian view of man. The only way that a non-state military force, I think, could even conceivably work is if they have non-monetary motivations. So, for instance, I mean, one could argue in the Old Testament that the army of Joshua was a non-state force.
Yeah.
You can even argue that Genghis Khan was a non-state actor.
Yeah.
But none of those people were operating off of a profit motive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even in more recent times, not just Hezbollah, but more or less the coalition of private military organizations that fought in the Israeli war for independence were private entities, or at least most of them other than the Haganah were private entities at the beginning. But by the end, they had been amalgamated into a true state.
Oh yeah, exactly. But the idea of a volunteer who you pay like in the American style, the reason why we always return to conscription in those wars is because we couldn't get those guys to fight the British long enough. They would just take the money and go home because it's in their rational self-interest to not get killed. Because that's the perverse incentive. If you pay people to fight, well, there's two perverse incentives. One is they don't want to fight, at least the actual soldiers. The other perverse incentive, and Keith Preston hinted at this, is that if you're an arms dealer, you're a mercenary, you only make money when there is a war. So their entire motivation is going to be to foment wars, not discourage them. And I think you kind of hinted at that, Keith, and maybe you'd want to add some more on that particular topic.
Yeah, well, one of the criticisms that we see that of the current national defense system in the United States that comes from both libertarians and from the left and even from paleocons to some degree is the problem of the merchants of death. What about the arms manufacturers? It's often argued, well, one reason why there are so many wars is because it's profitable for some people. You know, the Pentagon and all of that, they want to keep their budget high. They want to keep the defense contracts coming in and things like that. But that problem doesn't go away with a private defense system, particularly not one that's organized by commercial enterprises.
Yeah.
There's still going to be people that want to sell weapons in a private, purely privatized system, as well as one that's sort of it's kind of a public-private partnership like the one we have now. So that incentive is going to be there just as much as what you find in a state-run system. In fact, in some ways, it may increase, because if you're relying solely on commercial organizations, then you're going to have even more competitors in the field that are trying to sell weapons and sell military services and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly what happened in the late Roman Republic. When you privatized the defense, initially what happened was, before the Marian reforms, you had essentially a civic nationalist militia that was the Roman army. But due to social upheaval, that broke down in favor of standing armies loyal to private generals. Sulla and Marius initiating this trend, and then it culminates in Caesar making a bid for control of Rome itself. I would argue that it actually increases the amount of violence when you do that, because when you have at least a consensual state like ancient Greece, Rome, and the American Republic, there's this kind of like civic responsibility. Like you pointed out earlier, Keith, we don't have a coup d'etat from the U.S. Army because they have this responsibility to the idea of the Constitution. Well, there's going to be no such inhibitions for mercenary corporations or the merchants of death. They're not loyal to any document, any demographic. So they actually have no incentive to not do that. Whereas at least an army, like say the old Roman militia or the early American army, had this idea of loyalty to an idea, to a people, and that would actually discourage them from these sorts of merchants of death attitude. I would even argue the merchant of death problem is because we have privatized the military to the degree we already have. What are your thoughts on that, Mencken?
I think is that the cause? That's a good question, and it's sort of a counterfactual I haven't thought of. I would point out that defense contractor corporate lobbying on behalf of new military expeditions is fairly well documented. Scott Horton's entire show, his radio podcast, has been basically covering that topic for 16 years now. Lockheed, the article, Lockheed Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, was a pretty in-depth analysis by an author working for Playboy who looked at that, just how, because these companies exist to sell these weapon systems, they exist to make a profit, and they're basically restricted to only a few governments. There's a huge amount of lobbying to, number one, create a reason to use those. And war is cool because that means you're breaking major end items and you have to replace them. So it's cool if you're the guy selling them, but also lobbying for the ability to have fewer export controls on certain countries, so that weapon systems, American level weapon systems, could be exported to places like Saudi Arabia being the ultimate example as a justification for jobs, where the reality is there's very little, value added to the economy. It's just a circle of money going through different people's hands, where, people at in the establishment get to take their cut in the process. So absolutely, there is a demonstration of that sort of lobbying taking place right now, and we've got a couple of decades demonstrating that.
Well, another point to add to this is, Lockheed Martin now is kind of the butt of jokes because of the F-35 disaster. But when Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and all the other air manufacturing guys from say the 1930s to the early 70s, when we still had more of a civic nationalist attitude to our country, I mean, this was some of the most innovative, creative, spontaneous military hardware development in history. I mean, even in the late 70s, we had Lockheed coming up with the F-16 Fighting Falcon and the A-10 Warthog. But then during the war years, we had all sorts of creativity. Now, back under the whole Roosevelt New Deal, Fair Deal model with Roosevelt and Truman, Johnson, and all those guys, the military-industrial complex was less up for bid than it is now. And there seems to be a correlation between the more it's up for bid in contracts, the lower the quality of the military hardware becomes. You end up with the F-35 fighter. But when it's more for national war purposes, we get the T-47 Thunderbolt.
I agree with that in general, and I think we could probably find dozens of those examples, though I would caution you as somebody who's been in the military and has friends in the acquisitions pipeline that very often what the generals insist on building is not much better than something that was built by a corporation. I mean, John Boyd's entire biography basically talks about, his project that he started basically got co-opted into making the F-15 because that was the coolest thing out there in the world, but they made a dogfighter that couldn't dogfight, and it didn't have the right avionics to be a ground support aircraft. But he somehow still got away with making the F-117 and the F-16 in the process. So I agree with you. I'm just saying that frequently the establishment is pretty rotten on its own too.
Well, I think what we're getting at is a broader problem here is that bureaucracy itself, whether it's private or public, however you want to parse that, has a tendency to become rigid. And
Very so.
And it's, corporations have the same problem. Governments, it's really less private versus public in how to efficiently organize bureaucracy.
Absolutely. And to that point, I mean, any libertarian who hasn't spent time in corporate America and probably hasn't spent time in government, of course, I take that back since all of them seems to be employed by government universities. I would make the point that private bureaucracies can be every bit as bad as government bureaucracies, and both groups tend to facilitate a status quo mindset that doesn't see major upheavals and major, conflicts coming down the pipeline when, Ray Charles could see them coming at them, so to speak.
Well, it's kind of interesting too, because you mentioned that Germany in World War I being a sort of self-correcting bureaucracy. In many ways, the imperial staff of the German army was more adaptive than many private corporations in the United States today, which is an interesting paradox for the libertarians.
Yeah, and that's true of German private companies too. So that probably says more about German culture than anything.
Well, that's true. That's true.
And again, I'm not trying to hijack this conversation. Sorry if I cut you off, Keith.
No problem.
Oh, sorry. But what I was going to ask you though, Keith. You mentioned your thoughts about the mercenaries, and that was a good point. But the whole idea of like volunteers, that they'll point to like the American Revolution and the Civil War. I mean, I don't know how they just don't seem to be a long-term viable solution to the problem of the production of manpower services.
Yeah, I was going to say one thing that's frequently lost by civilians who talk about the civilians who don't work in the issue of providing security is the times in which you saw a major state move towards a purely all-volunteer army that was smaller. Usually that's because it was not economically and or politically viable to maintain a large standing army. And that was a way to ensure that key players that were needed in order to perpetuate the establishment, who were the innovators, were kept in government service as the organization did the necessary downsizing and purging so that they could actually transform into a new organization. The United States post-Vietnam, that was more or less the approach, though we can definitely say that, the Army, the United States military, the Army in particularly is basically a third-generation military that thinks it's, or second-generation military that thinks it's a third-generation military that pretends it's Star Trek. But the other big example would be the Reichswehr, the German military in between World War I and World War II. And part of what they did is that limited body of professional troops they did were meant to be innovators and developers who could develop new mobile doctrine, develop it further, as well as train the cadres that would become the officers and senior NCOs for new units in the beginning. It wasn't meant to actually fight a war.
Well, it's interesting. The British had a similar thing before World War I. They transitioned to a volunteer army, but then when they fought a big war, they realized that wasn't going to work, and they implemented conscription. I mean, does anybody honestly think that if in 1986 the Soviets drove through Fulda Gap, we would have reintroduced the draft? I mean, it's the funny paradox is only bloated empires can even toy with the idea of an all-volunteer army.
Yeah, and they can also generally the only ones who can afford a large standing army either, except for short periods of conflict. So it's almost like it's the same monster coming or going. But there's a reason we still have a selective service system in the United States, and it's not because we want to just hang out and have everybody register at 18. It's because the government wants the ability, number one, to document those people for any kind of service like a military draft, and secondly, because it's bureaucrats justifying their own existence professionally when there is no need.
One thing I would add to this is that when the United States went to the all volunteer military force in the 70s, part of the justification for that was it was argued, I think with some justification, that an all-volunteer professional force would be more efficient as a fighting force. Some of it was to take the wind out of the sails of the anti-war movement as well, the anti-Vietnam War movement, because there's less incentive to participate in the anti-war movement if you're not personally liable to draft. But it's also questionable as to whether the military system we have now is really the same thing as an all-volunteer service. We don't have conscription, but it's also true that people who join the military are not the same thing as employees in a company. Military service is not done on the basis of employment at will. When you sign up for the military, you sign an agreement to remain there for a certain amount of time, usually 2 to 20 years, depending on your agreement. And if you renege on that agreement, it's not just a matter of quitting your job. It's actually a criminal offense, and they'll put you in a military prison for it. So essentially, military personnel, even with the supposed all-volunteer system, are more like indentured servants in a certain way than actual employees of a business. I think that's an important distinction that has to be made. They can't just walk off the job if they just decide they don't like the job. I mean, maybe they can be discharged if the service decides they don't want them, and that certainly happens. I grew up with a number of guys like that. But I think that's one thing that's important to consider. One issue that the left raises, and I think has some merit, is that we also have something of an economic draft, in the sense that most folks who enlist in the military and remain there for long periods of time do not come from the privileged classes. That's one argument that's often been made against war and against military service and all kinds of things. Well, the rich are exempt, and they are. Most people that I've known personally who had spent time in the military certainly came from, poor to working class, maybe middle class backgrounds, rarely upper middle or upper class backgrounds, and certainly not in recent history. So there's something of an economic draft. Also, even excluding those two considerations, there's the fact that the United States is able to maintain the all-volunteer or all-professional military service in large part because it's paid for with taxes. If you took taxes out of the equation, the United States would not have the revenue that is necessary to recruit and train military personnel and maintain a large standing army that can be shipped overseas to fight international wars and things of that nature, and which is something that libertarians advocate for, is removing taxes as well. Mm-hmm. So that's another problem. And also, I believe someone alluded to this earlier, but the United States is only able to maintain a large army of that type because it has a large territory, with lots of people and lots of people to tax and lots of potential recruits for the military. It wouldn't be possible to stage an army comparable to the American military, say in Norway or something like that. I mean, just the sheer numbers of people are too small to not possible.
Especially not on the per capita soldier expenditure. I mean, the United States is one of the worst per capita expenditure amounts of any military.
Yeah, so the United States has this advantage of being able to have an all professional military because of these reasons, because of the fact that you do have a backdoor economic draft, you do have a system of organizing military service where it's not just employment at will, it's closer to indentured servitude or something comparable to that. And there is a large pool of people to recruit from, and there's a large economy to tax and finance this. A true volunteer military force would probably be something more like the volunteer fire departments that you find in rural areas and things like that. Those tend to be funded with volunteer labor. And the area that I grew up in had one of these, and that was, the members of this were all unpaid. It was funded through donations from individuals and private organizations. And that's more of the libertarian model. And if you really want to take libertarian theory to its logical conclusion, that's what they're advocating.
Yeah. I would step in for a moment and say that in most of the United States, the volunteer fire departments and rescue squads are currently going by the wayside because they lack the civil involvement in a lot of places for people to volunteer. So even though they have a lot of money, people aren't doing this job in a lot of communities. And the second point I would make up is in most communities that establish those kind of systems, and German-speaking countries still had them in many regions to include large cities until the very recent times, most of those places use some kind of civil conscription in order to fill their, quote, volunteer, unquote, fire departments as well.
Yeah, one thing that's sort of directly related to this, and this kind of just gets at the limitations of the libertarian model of interpreting history. See, when you're going to have a socio-economic political model, you're supposed to be able to make predictions with it, or at least explain with it what we actually observe. And again, you mentioned, Keith Preston, this sort of almost cartoonish idea that, well, since if the free market's good at making tennis shoes, it's going to be good at making bombs and conscripting soldiers. Well, one of the things that they never taught, and this is really just kind of crazy, because when I was growing up, I learned this in high school, that the English during World War I had ammunition shortages, and they had to have essentially government control of the economy. It was fixed by that those shortages were solved by David Lloyd George in the Munitions Act of 1915. J.A.R. Marriott, an English historian, writes, "No private interest was permitted to obstruct the service or imperil the safety of the state. Trade union regulations must be suspended, employers' profits must be limited, skilled men must fight, if not in the trenches, in the factories. Manpower must be economized by the dual dilution of labor and the employment of women. Private factories must pass under control of the state, and new national factories be set up. Results justified the new policy. The output was prodigious. The goods were at the last delivered." So basically, we have a market shortage of war production. And the thing is, that has never been covered in any libertarian literature that I've looked at. I've been studying this for 15 years. And I've seen nothing on it. And it's something you learn like in high school when you read about World War I. It's bizarre. Do you have what are your thoughts on that, Mencken?
Mostly it's just a matter of theorizing in a vacuum. Like that quip I made last week. Anytime you have the private production of defense debate, the ANCAP basically says, look at my, intellectually perfect theory, reality must conform to this. Whereas the person who, is counter their argument usually says, well, this is how reality works and has worked for the last 6,000 years of recorded history. So that's a lot of what I think it is. I mean, I've been in ANCAP circles. I'm still in a number of them. And there is a militant anger towards anybody who comes from those circles who point out that things like defense and local governance has never worked the way their perfect theories have patterned out, and also why the closest things to those were things that were experimented with in the paleo movement when they said we need to start looking at organic social traditions of various peoples, and that's the closest thing we're probably going to get in reality. Because essentially, when you point that out, you're a heretic, and it's just like being a racist in mainstream society. You're the person who's basically rejected the one true faith, so you have to be evil, and that's my experience.
Well, it's kind of analogous to Marxism, right? You can't criticize the theory; it never predicts history.
Yeah,
and then when you point that out, they get mad at you and call you a heretic.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I've toyed with or just thought about abstractly is there's a need for libertarians to develop something or have something like a libertarian Lenin, which I know sounds horrible, but part of what Lenin did is he took those, autistic economic theories of Marx and worked on making them an actionable political theory. Yes, there was a lot of issues with the Soviet state throughout history, but he made it so that some of those theories, or at least the closest thing, their derivatives of those theories, could actually be implemented in the real world. And I see very little in libertarianism willing to even look on those lines of how can we take these theories and build something that survives in the real life competitive world. And just pointing out that things have not happened the way they have predicted. And more importantly, that history is not inevitable, that things can go any number of ways, and that, trends and forces in history matter, but they're not exactly pointing irresistibly in the pattern that the Blessed Saint Rothbard said, is something that, and I like Rothbard, but that's something that that just goes on in libertarian circles. It is, for lack of a better word, a religion, I'd say almost like Weltanschauung, a worldview in the German sense, where it's, meant to be an all-encompassing way you look at the world. And the fact that reality doesn't conform to it is just a minor detail to a true believer.
Exactly. Now, Keith, you and I talked a couple of weeks ago, and you mentioned that Rothbard actually did say that we needed a libertarian vanguard. Maybe you could explain that a little bit.
Oh, yeah. From what I understand, there was a manuscript that Rothbard once wrote where he was talking about libertarian strategy. I believe he wrote this back in the late 70s at some point, and apparently it's never been published or it's available to the general public. But I remember once reading a discussion of it by some libertarians that had seen it. And he was basically discussing the ideas of Lenin on the idea of political organization and strategy. Rothbard was very heavily influenced by the Marxists when it came to a number of things, but political strategizing was one of them. And he argued that Lenin's idea of the vanguard party and things like that were, just basically rooted in the idea of a capitulation to the reality of modern organizations. He thought that there was nothing inherently wrong with the Leninist model. In fact, Rothbard was in favor of things like democratic centralism and things like that. During his New Left phase, he wanted to organize some of the groups that he had then along on this model, with a democratic centralist model, where you would have a party line that members of the organization were expected to adhere to. I guess in his case, it would be things like private defense agencies and World War II revisionism and all the other stuff, Austrian economics, all the stuff he was into. But that was certainly his outlook on things. He had this kind of Leninist influence idea on organization, and he applied that to all the different strategic models that he adopted over time.
Yeah, maybe one thing we end with is sort of what would be a more to sort of bridging the gap, as you pointed out, Mencken, of how one might begin to translate these privatizing military forces into the real world. I think we're all in agreement that the only really feasible way that's going to happen is if the primary motivation is not pecuniary, but some sort of nationalist or religious motivation.
Yeah, identitarian, I think is the best contemporary term for describing that.
Yeah, that itself, I don't think will guarantee it, but it's a necessary but not sufficient condition.
Yeah, it's the first step, not the last step in building those sorts of systems.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the key. The main problem when we look at the historical record, where there have been successful non-state militaries, is that these were pre-industrial and even pre-gunpowder. After gunpowder, the Mongols and the Huns and the raiders kind of got beaten off. And then after industrialization, it became even more difficult.
Yeah, I would add to that, throughout history, one of the issues is successful non-state militaries have a tendency of winning and then becoming a state by osmosis or by inevitability almost.
Well, that's true. I guess from your point of view, Mencken, what made these pre-industrial non-state actors so successful, and how might modern-day non-state actors attempt to appropriate those?
If we look at examples like the Mongols would be a good example, and I mean even in contemporary society, a good way may be the various private Israeli security forces that weren't part of the official Jewish agency. And the one commonality I can see there is mass mobilization by whoever was defined by, that tribal in-group, for lack of a better words, which means however they identify themselves as a coherent identity. And usually there was a sense that all males had some kind of military obligation. and the obligation that when they weren't in service, they had to maintain their readiness for war.
Didn't the Germanic tribes have a similar attitude in the 5th century?
They did. I'm not a real expert on that point. You see that throughout there. You see that on frontier cultures throughout the whole white Western tradition. We see that in large parts of the American colonies, from first coming ashore and organizing militia, companies that, went from very traditional line and column tactics to, very unconventional tactics very quickly, all the way to, I guess, into the 1920s is when the last Indian raids happened. So we had, some kind of continuation of that. So on the frontiers everywhere, there's been this idea that there's more than just the professional warriors and aristocrats. Every man who's a worker, and sometimes even a religious person, is also obligated to fight and obligated themselves to be combat effective, because that's how security happens in a place when you don't have anybody attacks.
I think basically what we're saying is that when we talk about the provision of mobilization services in a decentralized society, there's more responsibility on the individual than when it's externalized to the state.
Oh, absolutely. I'm somebody who subscribes to Frank Shodorov's thesis in general, that power, there's political power and social power, with political power largely meaning violence, but also the legitimated, organized polities of whatever form, and the alternative being social power, the things that are, endemic or integral to a culture. And one of the things that Shodorov said, and goes against much of the left libertarian ideas, is if you want to have political freedom, you need to have internal, organic social power. And that if people really want to become more free, then the first step is to make sure that their internal networks are, reinforcing and stronger. And I think in defense, that's very much this case. If you don't have a central governmental authority or a central corporate authority, then it has to be endemic to the culture. That culture has to stay at the lowest level possible. These duties of governance are things that we're obligated to do, whether the state says to or not. And that's part of mobilization, because it's not just total numbers of people for a cause. It's how much can they, put out. It's how much people do they have that they need, X percentage of their people to commit to the cause. And generally, those cultures that have a better cohesive identity have the ability to do more mobilization, because it's not just that they're all showing up, but they actually care about success versus failure, where generally mercenaries have a marginal interest in that.
Yeah, well, we're nearing the end of the allotted time, so why don't we begin with final statements? So how about we begin with you, Keith? What thoughts would you like to leave us with on this topic?
Well, I actually have an article about this that I wrote about 15 years ago. I wrote it for an anarcho-capitalist website that's now defunct, but it's simply a thought experiment about what this kind of private defense system would actually look like. It's on the attackthesystem.com website. It's called An Anarchist National Defense and Foreign Policy. Again, I wrote it about 15 years ago, and I haven't really gone back and read it since then. I mean, except to just skim it over. I don't know how much of it I would stand by today, but it's what I did with that, though, was I actually took a lot of these ideas that and anarcho-capitalists have about how this kind of system would work and tried to make it into some kind of coherent defense system. And I also brought in ideas from other sources like left-wing anarchism and fourth-generation war theory and things like that, from what I remember. But I remember when I wrote this, one of the things that was criticized about this article was that in it I talk about the free rider problem, and that's always been because at the time I was reading a lot of ANCAP theory and about this kind of stuff, and they were saying, well, the big issue is the free rider problem. What about all the people that don't want to pay for defense? What about all the people that don't want to be in the defense militia or whatever? And I addressed that by saying, well, it's not really an economic problem as much as it's a cultural problem, in the sense that to make this kind of system work, you have to have enough people in the society who believe in this and want this to work, and to the degree that they're going to put themselves out for it. They're going to donate money or time or serve in the militia or something. Without this kind of underlying cultural foundation, a system like this would never work. And I think that's really the first problem with a lot of these ANCAP theorists, is that on one hand, they think there's going to be this kind of private army that's a super fighting force that can fend off all attackers. On the other hand, this is going to be organized in a society of atomized individuals where no one has any loyalty to anything other than themselves. So I don't know that that's going to, that those are contradictory ideas. I think that for a non-state defense system to work, you would have to have a cultural foundation where, for whatever reason, and it could be all kinds of things, or it could be any, it could be a wide range of reasons, depending on the individual or group, but people are somehow committed to making this kind of project happen. And I think that's getting there from here is a problem. There's a huge range of problems with the ANCAP approach to national defense. There's the problem of who's going to organize it. Where's the funding going to come from? How's the recruiting and training going to be done? What's the incentive to fight? How effective are these groups going to be at fighting? How do you prevent them from going to war with each other? How do you prevent them from becoming a new state? What about cost prohibitive technologies? Like, could something like this organize its own nuclear arsenal? Those are all issues that have to be addressed, and and they all have to be addressed effectively. And all the ducks have to be in a row to make this system work if it has a chance of working. And I don't think that most ANCAP theorists that I have ever read really take these questions seriously. In fact, it's an issue I find interesting, and it's something I've always tried to stay abreast of in terms of what the latest ideas on this are. I've read all the works of David Friedman and Hans Hermann Hoppe and the myth of national defense and all these kinds of works, but I'm not persuaded by the strength of their arguments. I think that there's a lot of gaps that they need to flesh out, and I think that many of the problems are the ones we discussed earlier, and that is that they have this very rigid economic determinism where they just almost assume that the problem will take care of itself. That's a problem. That's a common slogan among these people, libertarians and ANCAPs. The free market will take care of it. So they just assume any problem the free market will take care of. It's the same issue they have when it comes to something like homelessness. Well, don't worry about that. The private charities will take care of them, except some of them don't believe in that either. So, so it's there's a lot of holes in these theories that need work, definitely, to make them more viable.
Yeah. So what would you like to end with, Mencken?
I'd start by saying I apologize for talking over Keith the entire time, and I have that habit. I would say the biggest thing I'd say up front, especially the ANCAPs who are listening, I am, believe it or not, after all things, still an advocate for decentralization. I think that decentralization of a sort is inevitable. I'm somebody who, in the tradition of Martin Van Creveld, thinks that we will see the decline of the state, which again doesn't mean the end of government or somehow the rise of atomized individuals. It means that the form of governments we've had for the last few hundred years are probably going to pass out of practice. But my biggest criticism, why I do insist on attacking the anarcho-capitalist theory of defense, is, as I repeated several times, it is a theory in a vacuum that reality doesn't match up with, and there's no interest, at least by the people making a living spouting these theories of private defense, how to take reality into consideration and to adapt approach, or even to create an approach to get into power. As I made that quip that anarcho-capitalism is a theory of governance without a plan for taking power. Well, if you don't have a plan for how you're going to come to power, and even worse, you're somebody who thinks these things are inevitable, and it's not just ANCAPs who believe that. I know white nationalists who think things are inevitably going to happen, and we're somehow all going to be rich and have a post-scarcity society as soon as we get rid of the blacks and the Jews. All those people who believe in inevitability they're not engaging in politics. What they're engaging in is eschatology, because it's just a hope that if I'm somehow a good person, things are just going to happen, and it's not going to involve myself at all. And I would say to any person on the political spectrum, if you care about your ideas, you need your ideas to stand up to some rigor in reality. That's my first point. And my second point would be, part of why there's no attempt to apply the rigor of reality to theories like the private production of defenses. It's economists with no knowledge of military history, no knowledge of military culture and sociology even. And I have a similar issue again with white nationalists who think that if we all wear Hugo Boss, we're somehow produced the greatest military in the history of the world. And I tell people, if you actually care about these things, you need to spend some time looking into military history and looking at some of the better memoirs and biographies of successful military leaders who are trying to accomplish the same things that you're talking about. Now, I would say if you're talking about the private production of defense and you're also talking about an ethno-nationalist security apparatus, I would say you need to go out and read what some of the Zionists wrote in prior to and during the war of Israeli independence. And I immediately get hate mail every time I make that. But if you're serious about what you're talking about politically, and this isn't a game where you're shit posting in between real work at work, you actually need to go and do some homework and learn about these things.
Yeah, exactly. I think basically what I would say is that for the sort of non-state production of defense is two components. There's the sort of market component, and then there's the historical example of non-state actors. From my point of view, it is a market failure. Market forces alone cannot solve the problem, but that doesn't necessarily mean that non-state forces could not fix the problem necessarily. And the last thing that you brought up, Mencken, reminds me of this oft-quoted refrain from Murray Rothbard. It is no crime to be ignorant of economics, which is, after all, a specialized discipline and one that most people consider to be a dismal science. But it is totally irresponsible to have a loud and vociferous opinion on economic subjects while remaining in this state of ignorance. Well, exactly. And I think when it comes to politics, warfare, and history, the libertarians strike out on all three. So this is your host, Todd Lewis, from the Praise of Folly podcast. Thanks again, Keith and Henry Mencken, for joining us. This is signing off.